joined by Alon. Alon, give us a wave. Alon is CEO and co-founder of Tastewise. He has a wealth of experience in leveraging AI and big data across technology, business, and marketing. Notably, he did that at Google, where he initiated and launched the Google Partners Program in 27 countries, serving as Google's chief marketing officer for both Israel and Greece. He also led the company's relationship with the World Economic Forum. In addition to all of the amazing work that he does at Tastewise, he's a human rights activist for the LGBTQ community, and he holds a BA in economics from Tel Aviv University, a master's in law from Bar Ilan University, and an MBA from the University College Dublin. So a very busy man, and we're grateful for his time here. David, who will also give us a wave, is the ESG Director for the International Zone at Kraft Heinz, which is everything outside of North America. He is an FMCG industry veteran with close to 20 years experience in sales, commercial, and supply chain. And he has spent the last 4.5 years working in ESG. So lots of experience and a wealth of perspective to share with us. David is part of the UK Plastics Pact Advisory Board and a founding member of the OECD Sustainable Supply Chains Initiative. And he works closely with government and NGOs alike. So he's joining us from London this afternoon/evening. So thank you very much for having us, or for joining us here. And the floor is yours. We're going to spend about half an hour talking about all things sustainability. I will be off camera, but we'll pop in with any questions as they come up. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Miriam, for this introduction and for organizing this. David, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. In preparation, we've been discussing so many, of the hot topics that, the industry out there is trying to cope with. And as you know, we are working in the food industry, and consumers are everything, and they're at the center of every conversation and every decision making that we have to make, right, to be able to make 100%. The change. So can you just tell us, David, what is actually your job? I mean, ESG is the hot topic that even us as a company, we're helping a lot of companies with, a lot of the food brands out there. What do you do at Kraft Heinz International Zone? What is your
Thanks,
job?
Alon. But firstly, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I love talking about these topics, getting inputs and getting thoughts and different perspectives from yourself, and also hopefully those listening today. So I guess actually just touching on the consumer piece first, it's one of the things I love about FMCG. I had a brief stint out with consumer electronics, and I think the focus we have as FMCG on consumers makes us very different. So in terms of my role, I sit on the international growth team. So for those of you who don't know, that's sort of like the corporate strategy team that we have here at Kraft Heinz. Like Miriam said, the international zone is everything outside of North America, and I report directly into our global ESG lead. So I have a foot in both camps. I drive the overall strategy, but I also get the opportunity to really focus on the key core ESG areas. And to your point, what are those core ESG areas? Well, the wonderful thing, but also the challenging thing, is ESG is so broad. When you think about it, obviously it stands for environment, social, and governance. So it touches everything we do, whether it's human rights, which was brilliant to hear in your introduction, our environmental footprint, but also how we hold ourselves as a company, how we govern the decisions we make. And I think that's a really big part of what I do, is trying to make sure that we can be consistent in both those big ambitions, but also the smaller decisions that get made every day by teams across the globe.
Wow, fascinating. So if we try to narrow down the conversation just for to get started, sustainability is prior to COVID, if we were looking at sustainability, it was actually booming. People were talking about how they can save planet Earth if they stop using plastic straws, and obviously the pandemic came, the Maslow pyramid enforced all of us consumers to think about our well-being and survival before anything else, and we saw that sustainability was not top of mind, to say the least. You would walk down the streets and you see so many face masks on the floor, polluting everything way more than any plastic straw damage did in the air. So what we've been observing is that after COVID, the graph started going back up. So consumers started caring about sustainability again, more than before, but actually something dropped in the middle, and it's still not significant enough. And it's not significant enough, especially for corporations, to make decisions just based on sustainability. So how do you prioritize a world where the consumers are not willing to pay the extra buck for something that is more sustainable? How do we go about this and make sure that we're changing the decision making for a more sustainable future?
Yeah, it's a really good reflection, Alon, because I think in the immediate aftermath of COVID, so as soon as we were hit by it and it was this new experience, there was this real awakening as consumers and as citizens of the planet, where we appreciated, you could see the direct impact. There's some great images about the cleaner rivers, the fog, but over the course, as it extended, people started to obviously take some of the sort of primary needs a little bit more into focus, and sadly reverted back to type. I would say one thing that's been positive, though, is the number of commitments, certainly around climate, that big corporations have made. I think prior to COVID, it was about 20% of organizations had made a net zero commitment, and now it's above 60%. So we've made some good progress, but there is a real challenge in terms of the cost impact and the choices that organizations are making, because we've gone from the initial challenge of COVID, we've then gone into supply chain disruptions, supply chain challenges, and then that has continued with the inflationary environment, which I think we have to see through the lens of climate change. A lot of these inflationary challenges have been driven by geopolitical instability, climate change and yield impact, and the then consequence choices in terms of security of supply, security of and energy security hitting most of these organizations. So I think it's a real challenge. The consumers who are choosing sustainable choices was a much greater niche, and they measure effectively what's the premium of sustainability, and it was well over 30%. In the most recent report, that dropped to around 28%. So as you start to see it becomes more of a mass approach, we start to see that reverting back to type, and you have to take the assumption that consumers aren't necessarily prepared to pay more to be more sustainable. We have to make those choices for them.
Yeah. So here's the thing, making something more sustainable without increasing the price may take a lot of technology, and that's something that's an evidence of the food tech, ag tech industry booming, right? Because it's clear that the future must go there, and actually, even from financial economic perspective, you really have to change your supply chain and the way you go about producing. But let's focus for a second on the transformation of plant-based. We know how much damage animal-based protein brings to the environment. And one interesting story I have to tell about that is that we did a playful quiz to 100 professionals that were working on animal plant-based protein substitutes. And we asked them, in your opinion, what is the number one reason for consumers to choose plant-based protein? And actually, we were so sad and shocked to see that the people that were supposed to be developing products for the industry were getting it all wrong. So only 20% of the people that took part in the quiz actually got the answer right, which is health. They all thought sustainability was the driver for plant-based eating and animal cruelty, but actually, if you look at the mainstream, it's 5 times bigger than health is 5 times bigger than animal welfare and sustainability combined. So is the secret going sustainable or helping people choose sustainable, making sure that the products are also healthy, which makes even more complex task for the R&D teams out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you've reflected there is this always quite sad state of affairs where I trumps we. Quite often it's what's in it for me as a consumer, which is driving those choices. And like I said at the beginning of COVID, I think that was a real opportunity where people started to look through a slightly different lens. The sad thing is we've reverted back to type. So we have to deliver both in reality. We have to drive choices around portfolio, about innovation, that are doing the best thing from a corporate point of view, because it's not necessarily the cost of action. It's not necessarily those investments. That comes with all innovation in many ways. If you're doing something new for the first time, if you're looking to innovate, there are seeding costs. There are investment choices you're going to have to make before you get to a mature profit delivery. That is the case whether it's plant-based or other topics within sustainability, which I'm sure we can touch on later. But it's the cost of inaction in this respect. It's the choices that we have to make to drive the right approach. Plant-based health is a primary concern when you think about our global population. Given the advances in medicine and technology, in a very short period of time, probably in the next 5 years, diet and obesity and diet-related diseases are going to be the single biggest killer to the adult population. So we shouldn't minimize diet alone. From a consumer point of view, it's absolutely critical, but we also need to look at it through the environmental lens as well.
Yeah, when you think about it, planet Earth tripled its the number of people in 100 years or so, which is staggering. You keep saying that. What happened? Why now? Right? We just outnumbered the resources on planet Earth, and it seems like more burning than ever to make the shift. But as a fairly large corporation that touches so many billions of people's lives through food, how do you prioritize? How do you decide for which category, in which product you can make the biggest impact that will also be making an impact both on your bottom line, right? Because we do know that it makes a difference, but also from an environmental perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. There are almost sort of no regret choices that we need to make as an organization. These are choices that will impact our overall, for example, carbon footprint. They will impact our full value chain human rights. These are choices that we need to make as an organization independent of the product proposition. Then we've got to find a way to think about specifically what is the right product proposition. You touched on meat quite rightly, and certainly from a North American footprint, we've got a large meat portfolio, meat and dairy portfolios. If we decided to discontinue our meat and dairy overnight, that demand would just shift elsewhere. What we've got to do is make sure we've got stewards of these businesses who can make the right decisions to improve the overall footprint, whether that's investing in regenerative agriculture, whether that's consumer comms to help them transition and adapt their choices and their preferences. We've got a major challenge. You talk about the global population, but there's this split between effectively the global north and the global south, the developed and the developing nations. And the consumption of meat and dairy in the developed nations is a challenge in itself. But in the developing countries, meat is seen as this luxury item, this premium that isn't currently consumed in the vast quantities it is in the developed world. And as they start to pull themselves out and have the social mobility to be able to afford meat and dairy products, there's a real risk that we'll see increased consumption in those categories rather than decline. So we need to think about how do we develop the right communications to our consumers? How do we develop the right propositions? And how do we find a way to talk about different ingredients in a way that can benefit the health of the planet and the health of the consumer? In reality, if you think of a retail environment and strip back the brand, strip back the products and think about them as ingredients and commodities, our retail stores are dominated by some mega commodity categories. You look at cereals, you look at dairy, you look at different areas within those propositions, even arguably tomatoes. The commodities that dominate stores have not been the commodities that are best for the health of the planet and the health of the consumer. They have been easy to grow. You could load them with salt, fat, sugar, and make a huge markup. And that's what we've existed as a big food over the last 150 years. We need to transition and provide consumers with something that's good for them and good for the planet.
Yeah, we see that the interesting part about Tastewise as a platform is helping these large corporations to basically decide where to innovate and what to do first to make a big impact. And 90% of the activity on our platform is around better for you and better for the environment. So everybody is, working towards there. But when we're talking, you mentioned, meat and dairy. These are like big categories. And as you said, in the developing world, animal-based protein was not a standard. How do you I heard this while traveling in India right before COVID. I learned something culturally that was so different. How they call carnivore in India?
No, tell me.
They call them non-veg. So if you think about it, the reverse was actually the plant-based era was already there, and now the developed countries are impacting badly on it. But really, if we're touching upon animal-based protein, there's a lot of conversation in the plant-based protein and all the food tech companies that are coming up, that there is heavy subsidies, direct and indirect, into the animal-based protein that governments have been, pushing and providing for many centuries, because it employs a lot of people, because it's traditional farming, even in developed countries like Switzerland, right? How do you see that in terms of like making the change? I mean, it's not just up to the to the corporations and the businesses. If governments are subsidizing in a way this traditional industry that was actually sustainable when we were like a couple billion people on planet Earth, and now we're like close to double digit.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't think we can overlook the transition that's required in many different ways. There's a huge green transition that needs to be done. And the difficulty within the food industry is something like 40% of the global population are in some way associated with the food industry. So we have to be very mindful of the impact, but that shouldn't stop us making that transition. It should be the exact opposite. We should be accelerating that transition and driving the changes that are required. That's exactly the purpose of the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative that we're working with the OECD and the G7 countries, because when we look at the investment choices, the subsidies around those mega commodities, mega ingredients, they aren't directed for the health of the planet, and we need to find a way to show the real pricing of those commodities and drive the right progress for us as a as a civilization. Fundamentally, that's the key piece. Addressing some of those inherent imbalances that make it much harder to drive the right choices for everybody. I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it brings me to the question. Maybe from your experience, it takes a whole village, right, to change such a big. Who do you think would be the key player that we should keep an eye on and really work with to drive the needed transformation in the industry and consumers acceptance and approval?
Well, I think I would possibly look at it the other way. Whilst I think it's a great question, it's difficult to address the scale and the volume that's currently required for the food industry. Like the sad reality is we arguably overproduce as an industry. If you look at the levels of food waste, if you look at the levels of obesity in the adult population, and even sadly in the population of under 18s as well, we overproduce. So production isn't a challenge. What we need to do is change the way that we produce, change the way that we do it, and we need to hold the big food companies accountable. We need to be measuring their performance, driving and requesting the transparency to drive that progress, because there are the disruptors and there are the transformers. That's what the future will be. I'm very lucky to work in an organization that's been around 150 years. For us to be around in 150 years time, we have to transform or we'll be disrupted. And the example I always talk about within our organization is that the very first Heinz product was horseradish. It was not ketchup, it was not beans, it was not mayonnaise or anything else that we may now well be associated with. It was horseradish. Great organizations adapt to their consumer needs, and those consumer insights are critical to drive that change. And I think that's what's got to be key, is drive the accountability for the organizations who exist. It's then on them to transform. If not, they will be disrupted by up and coming either consumer demand or organizations that can take advantage of it.
Yeah, you mentioned an interesting statistic that 40% of people actually are somehow involved in food production or food industry.
Yeah.
An interesting stat I saw recently was that 10% of the workforce in America is working in the food service restaurant industry. Just in that. I mean,
just in food service. Wow.
10% of a workforce. And actually, obviously, they're responsible for so many people, and that without taking into consideration retail, groceries, farming. And so it's not just in the developing countries, just to say, it's actually a big challenge. So when we think about the future of food, and the industry, us, and also governments, they need to think about the future of work as well, yes. Right? What 100%. Will people do when we automate, when we get AI to do a lot of things, and robotics that will do. And I know, coming from the digital space in the past, there was always a conversation about future work. What would people do if everything was more automated and digital? And it's a big question to be asked. But I love your example about horseradish, right? We're seeing a big comeback when it comes to food trends. Food trends, I divide into two different kinds of food trends. The first kind is what we all refer to food trends. It's the culinary trend, right? It's like, what do people consume? Is it like horseradish now? Is it ube? Is it chia? Is it monk fruit? To sweeten your food, in a natural way. So this is one part, right? The culinary part, the applicative part. But actually, what's more interesting is the motivation, benefit, and the need, and how that's changing. And what we've been seeing both on the culinary side and also on the motivational side, we've been seeing a retro, going to the past. So, kombucha, right? Fermented, mushrooms in a way. I remember my grandma, she's from Iraqi origin. She used to ferment, all kind of vegetables, and we all used to, drink the brine, the liquids that were part of the process. And so that's now like one of the biggest, hits in beverage. So it's an interesting thing. So you think we're going back to more clean, more less processed kind of foods? Is that the future?
I think there's definitely a role for it. Look, you touched on something that's absolutely critical to both the challenges and the opportunities. In reality, food and consumer habits are quite nostalgic, but particularly food. People rely, the behaviors, the habits, what we eat is quite often dependent on what we associate through childhood and influence there. But you've then got this other factor of exploration and people traveling further afield and discovering, artisanal type products and processes which have created something that is pretty traditional in the regions it's from. So you've got these two fighting factors, and it's finding ways for those two things to coexist. The big from an overall concern point of view is this idea of perhaps ultra processed, and you touched on plant-based, and that's one of the big concerns around plant-based. When you look at some of the ingredient lists of some of the things that it's very easy to fill it with ingredients and preservatives that aren't familiar to consumers. And it's striking that right balance, because I think consumers do want to live cleaner. They want to have that transparency of where their food's coming from, what it contains. They want that feeling of nostalgia from what they had in the past, and they want to be excited and delighted by new exploration. So I think all of these things play a role in that future.
Yeah, I think that one of the insights that drive consumers, to eating and consuming plant-based protein, and doing so repeatedly, right? So the magic with food production is like consumption frequency. How do you find your product? How do you get your product to people's tables and plates, repeatedly? And one of the drivers we're seeing for animal protein substitutes is health. So if your product is not healthy, people will try it out because it's cool, because it's on the menu, because it's on the shelf. They'll try it, but will they buy it repeatedly? Will the consumption frequency increase? Because otherwise you don't have a viable business, and that's why it's important more than ever to better understand what are the drivers of consumers in different categories, what would make a difference for them, and then how to put this benefit forward to drive the change. But as we said now, the base is that the transformation really must be healthy. So if it's going to be more sustainable and not so healthy, it's not going to work. For instance, the meat industry is using a lot of plastic, packaging, right? Because it's the best way to preserve the meat. Now, if you will be replacing it with, paper-based or anything else, then the shelf life will be way shorter, and then that will will end up with a lot more pollution and negative impact on the environment. So how do you strike this balance? Have you seen any interesting technologies that we should put an eye on for the future of more sustainable food?
So I think there's a couple of key elements, I think, to your question, Alon. Firstly, there is no perfect when it comes to the future, whether it's be ESG or more broadly, or whether it's sustainable. There's only better choices, and hopefully we'll innovate and improve from that. Sometimes that's scary to people because they're searching for perfect and they won't take a step in the right direction. But you've got to be clear on what are the areas of concern, what are the areas that matter to you, and build that into a decision-making framework so that you can make the choice that's best for the overall environment at that time, accepting that it won't be perfect. I think going back to packaging, I think there is a huge investment associated with packaging. Like it's whilst nobody in FMCG, I would argue, makes packaging, we're reliant on it in many ways. We've built factories around it. Everything is structured around the packaging that we've got. However, there's loads of great innovation out there. There's loads of opportunities for us to do things differently. And that's the challenge we lay down as an organization there, that's the focus for us. As part of that, less packaging comes to reusable and refillable. And I think this is one of those consumer value action gaps that's very, very evident. If you ask people in terms of would they buy products that have refillable or reusable packaging, you get a response rate of about 74% of consumers say, yeah, I'll consider that. I'll absolutely do something around that. The reality is we've done many, many trials from a refillable, reusable, and they fail because consumers aren't changing to that. And I think that's one of those value action gaps that we have to close to really drive progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's there are so many tech companies and food tech companies trying to solve different parts of the process, from supply to all the way to packaging and serving and so on. And it does seem like that there's some early adopters, right? For instance, all the meal kit, these boxes that comes to your front door once a week with exactly the ingredients you need to have without packaging, right? Most of it is, but then obviously it really is for the early adopters that can afford that, right?
Yeah.
And not for as we have to face reality. I mean, the vast, big part of even the developing world need to get as many calories as possible a day for their dollar, right? And it's a real challenge, and also it's a real opportunity, because if you manage to do that in an efficient way that maybe technology can help solve, then you can kind of, my mom never used a computer. She just went from typewriter all the way to a tablet, right? So maybe we can make this transformation also in our universe, and make sure that we continue to spread the news. And one thing we've been doing, we realize we are working with the large multinationals and also up and coming food tech companies, trying to better understand consumers so they know where to focus, so they can drive the change and not come up with products that ended up discontinued like 90% of the innovation, right? I keep saying, and I'm sharing with my team, that if we got 50% of the innovation right, we could help so many consumers. We could help them get what they actually need and actually want, and that is part of our mission. But we found that we work with the large multinationals, but also we have to start working with nonprofits that try to educate consumers on why they should make different choices. But we're only getting started. So we said it takes a whole village.
You've touched on a key part there. If we're serious about the transformation that's required, whether that be in nutrition or whether that be in the environment, we have to make it affordable. If we really want significant volumes to drive the change, it needs to be affordable solutions.
Yeah. So when you look at the priorities, if we take a step back and say, what do consumers take into consideration when they go to the shelf and buy something? It's like, first and foremost, it's price, right? If it's not affordable, they can't buy it, right? And then taste. So never compromise on the taste and the mouthfeel and the texture and all that. It's not replaceable. And only then, you have the brand and the packaging and the convenience of the packaging, down to health. And very low at the bottom, sustainability. We have to bring it up so it will change, consumption behavior, and hopefully will also help change the industry's approach to getting us there much faster.
I hate to interrupt. David and Alon, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. I was typing furiously notes for myself for further consideration. So thank you for sharing your perspectives. We've gotten quite a few questions in, so I want to spend the next 10 minutes at least addressing a few of them. And then with maybe your permission, we can somehow collaborate after to get your perspective on these questions
Sure.
as well. I want to start with one that I feel is connected to the point that you just made, David, about affordability. So maybe you can extend beyond that. So this question reads, David, you mentioned that consumers aren't prepared to pay more to be sustainable. We need to make those choices for them. Can you elaborate on what you mean by making those choices, and what are the most important priorities to consider, given that affordability is a top consideration?
Absolutely. So I think, this touches on probably a number of key areas for us as an organization, but just give you some specific examples. Our carbon footprint. There are many different ways that we can tackle that footprint. The biggest part that we're focusing on is regenerative agriculture. Now, we've created industrial farming, as an industry that has been optimized for cost, that has been optimized for yield, that's been optimized for production volumes. And if we're going to take a different approach, that's the right thing to do for the biodiversity of the region, if we're going to make choices that's the right thing to do to eliminate the use of agrochemicals and reduce our carbon footprint, that's going to impact some of those choices. That's going to get in the way of some of the legacy optimization that we've had. That's not to say it can't be optimized in the future, but there's a cost of transition that's going to come. Now, I don't think ourselves as an organization or any other food company should expect that cost of transition to be picked up by the consumer. That is a choice that we need to make. Similarly, on packaging, moving from a plastic non-recyclable packaging format to something that can be fully recycled, that cost shouldn't come to the cost of the consumer. That should be a cost of transition in the same way any other innovation has that investment upfront to make the transition work.
Yeah, David, maybe to address that, that in some countries, actually, when you buy a plastic bottle, you actually have to pay extra, and if you want to return the bottle, you get the fare, and maybe it needs to be done also with food-related packaging, but the infrastructure is not there to even collect all of it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, Alon. Like, deposit return schemes is a real way of working. We just need to price it right. I think it's one of the reasons refillable, reusable packaging's failed in many trials, and I think Loop, for example, have pulled out of, have ended their pilot with Tesco in the UK because the premium we were asking as part of that deposit return scheme didn't meet the value equation for consumers. But if it's a small amount, if it's something that they can get back, if it's something that they can collect, if you look at their deposit return schemes and the level of packaging that comes through reusable in Latin America, it's huge. It can work. We need to find ways to look at all of the different externalities to drive these solutions.
Yeah, and actually, what you mentioned, carbon footprint and industrial farming and regenerative farming. Actually, this is top of mind for consumers. There's a lot of interest around that. And an interesting anecdote, again, going back retro to the past, in Judaism, if you're a farmer, you have to let the earth rest every 7th year. It's called a sabbatical, and it's actually so doing a comeback to what our ancestors used to be doing, and we're back there.
Similarly, I saw an article in a publication for farmers from 1920s, which said these are the 10 steps to be a successful farmer. And you look at the list now, and it's basically the principles for regenerative agriculture. And somewhere along the line, we got lost with almost the ease of use of agrochemicals and perhaps the demand and the greed from a food industry point of view.
Yeah, an interesting another anecdote there is that a lot of the new novel ingredient companies that are trying to come up with even flavors and fragrances that are 100% natural, using fermentation, using advanced technologies, and so there's future for that as well. There's a lot going on the food tech and ag tech side to do a lot more vertical farming, making sure you optimize, but also making sure that maybe you don't need to grow your vanilla on earth. Maybe you can do it in a greenhouse and make sure that it's hydroponic growth. So it's an interesting movement there as well.
I want to make sure that we have time for our final two questions. There are many more, but I want to try these out. So Let's start with this one. Yesterday was 8 billion day. So for those who aren't familiar, yesterday was the date that was calculated that we formally and officially have reached 8 billion people on the planet as of yesterday, which is quite a milestone and comes with its own set of concerns. So this says, you've spoken a bit about the different approaches and challenges in the global north and the global south, and how to introduce categories against increasing wealth and access that are better for the planet. How do we develop those right propositions? How do we involve consumers in that process? And how do we accelerate change in a way that places the consumer at the center if consumers themselves aren't aware of what's best for planet, for example, or prioritize something else? I also want to add to this, perhaps also considering the legacy of colonization and the tensions and roles there between the global south and the global north. It's a big question, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts.
Well, honestly, that's a massive question.
It is.
And I'm probably not going to be able to unpack all of it. It's a great debate. So one of the things we recently just on Saturday we launched COP27 was our Beans is How campaign. So we're one of the founding partners of this brilliant coalition that's aiming to double beans consumption over the course of the next 5 years. And particularly in the sort of the global south, beans is such a core staple for the diet that we overlook it. And the reality is we talk about planet health, we talk about consumer health, beans, pulses, legumes, however you want to describe that category of ingredients is such a great opportunity. When we think about bringing that to developed nations, the risk is around cultural appropriation and some of the challenges there. Yeah. But certainly in the developing world, it's about how do we take something that they already consume and find ways to just raise it up. So not changing it, not bringing in things that are successful in the US, successful in the UK, successful in continental Europe, but building the culture, the food options around the culture that exists, around the diet that exists. So we're just building on the great stuff and the great legacy that's appropriate to those regions. I think that's how I would very much think about it from certainly from a colonial point of view. And then what we need to do in the developed world is bring what they know about these products, bring some of those exploration and flavors and ingredients, and it's incredible. We had an event at Google New York where we also brought it and had fantastic cuisines based on it from all of the regional chefs around the Google world, as it were, and the cuisine is mind-blowingly tasty. It's fantastic. What we've got to do is bring that exploration into the cuisine and the diets of the developed world, because I think that's how we start to bring transition. We can't tell people not to eat meat and dairy, but what we can do is bring ingredients that are good for the planet and help them see the cuisines, the flavors, the benefit of that as part of their life.
Yeah. So what you're saying, David, is like make beans great again. This is a great. And I agree, and there is so much you can do with the beans, and you don't have to just consume them in the canned form. There's a lot of sprouting happening these days, right? That makes everything we eat so much more nutritioning. So it doesn't cost a lot. It's just like a little bit of work, and maybe it's another way to contextualize this ingredient that's been there for so long and needs to be brought back. For instance, when I lived in Ireland many years ago, I was so surprised to see people eating beans on like a toast. I was like, what happened to humanity? It's like, because it's so far away. I come from Israel, where the Mediterranean diet is so big, everything must be fresh. I mean, in America there was the rise in a bowl, right? Like people eating dishes. It was a new dish format that started. I remember Miriam and I wrote a report about it 4 years ago, and people were like shocked. Like, do you eat a whole meal just out of a bowl? And that's what we've been doing for so many decades. We just eat like raw, fresh ingredients, but it's also a luxury of living in the Mediterranean, where you have access to affordable, vegetables and fruits. But there's definitely like the need to contextualize your product for different audiences in different countries is immense. And we're seeing from our data, what's acceptable in Brazil is not what's acceptable in the UK. And like, how do you bridge that? Yeah. And how do you contextualize the product in a way that is exciting for the consumer is actually an interesting idea. I'll take it with the team as well. To push more of that, because there's so many great products that are more sustainable. We just need to make sure that consumer feel excited about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Alon. We've got some nice reactions there from folks who seem to enjoy that answer. So we need to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time. I'll quickly say out loud the questions we've received just to pique people's appetite and interest, and maybe give David and Alon some food for thought for hopefully the next time that we can speak about this. So the first was, we're seeing an interest, and this is from a member of actually my team from Tastewise. We're seeing an interesting trend towards communal experiences in food and beverage. You mentioned nostalgia, but there's also shared experiences post-COVID, kitchen travel, authentic experiences. Do you think there's an opportunity here to rewire the I before we to something more collective and leverage that for interest in sustainability? Which I think is a fascinating question. The second is transformation and disruption for big food. What needs to happen in the market to drive accountability of organizations? And finally, for today at least, what are the hidden costs of a commitment to sustainability, and how can brands navigate them successfully? So lots of food for thought here. Thank you both so much for your time. This was a fascinating conversation, and I hope that we can continue this conversation as a community, as an industry, for the years to come. So thank you. If anyone is interested in rewatching this recording, it will be made available to you as soon as possible. So keep an eye out in your email from me in the rest of the week, maybe into next week. And with that, thank you both.
Thank you
It's
so
been
much.
a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for having us.
Thank you, David and Alon.